You deserved everything you got. This is a union city.
That is a Philadelphia tradition.
Seize the means of podcasting.
Oh, God, the bosses crushed us.
Let me tell you one thing else.
In oldie-timey times,
Who said it? Kanye West or Thomas
we
Paine?
will not have raw dog reality for that one.
The pleasure of the flesh is in solidarity.
The Scab Buster.
It's gonna be wholly unprofessional.
Keep together strong. Let that be your mantra. Cordwainer is an oldie-timey term for shoemaker. So we also have to talk about apprentice, journeyman, and masters. Journeyman was a classification of worker left over from the guild system. And basically, the way it worked was you'd start out as an apprentice, and you would sign a certificate of indenture, which basically just meant you had to do what the master says. And in return, the master would teach you, they would clothe you, and they would house you for whatever the length of the indenture was. Usually it was like 5 to 7 years, but could be longer, could be shorter. Then after your apprenticeship, you would become a journeyman, and that meant you could go and seek employment anywhere, or go and work for another master. And then the master was a journeyman who worked long enough to basically afford their own shop and had enough wealth to basically buy property and have tools to not quite hire out, but to once you owned the means of production, you could be a master and then hire other people.
Last I left you, I was but a learner, but now I am the master.
Exactly. I don't know if this podcast endorses the midichlorian approach, so we're not going to go down that.
Those poor union builders who created the Death Star.
I know.
Especially the second one. It wasn't even done.
No, I mean,
I think the destruction of the second Death Star was like an insurance scam.
That's probably true.
Because somebody got a lot of money out of that.
Yeah. Anyway.
No, we're not. We're continuing this. We're talking about the Tatooine Local 73.
Well, damn. Now I'm sure someone has written a labor history in the Star Wars universe, and now I need to research that.
And email us, because you're going to be on the show next week.
Yes. So, Master had accrued enough capital to set themselves up as a shop. And then they would take in orders and basically like sub them out to journeymen or apprentices. But a lot of the time, they would do some of the work alongside their workers. So there wasn't as much of a divide as you got once you get into the industrial age, where the owners really were adding nothing productive. So during the 18th century, that was kind of the standard system of how trades operated. It kind of created this artisan aristocracy. So you had, within 18th century society, you had kind of the old money landed gentry that came over to the colonies. Then you also had sort of a new money aristocracy that was coming up, and those were the masters or the tradesmen that became masters and then got into the merchant trade. There was always a tension between the journeyman and the master, because the journeyman was still being paid by the master. So you still had that employer-employee relationship to a certain extent. So journeyman wanted more money for less work. Master wanted more work for less money. That's just how that tension exists.
That's the way that the world goes around.
Yeah. Traditionally, the way it would work is you'd go to a master and basically commission a pair of shoes. Then the master would sub that out to a journeyman or an apprentice, depending on the skill level of the apprentice. Or they would sub out different parts of the job. There were a couple points where both master and journeyman actually worked together, because the masters actually had a somewhat illegal conspiracy to keep wages or to keep prices set so that they could basically control prices and make sure that they were all making a good profit. When someone came in and would try to undersell that, then both the journeymen and the masters would team up to go after that person. Because that person was both reducing prices and reducing wages.
Yeah.
So their interests aligned a little bit there. But there was still that tension. So towards the end of the 18th century, you started to see market work show up, which was rather than making a bespoke shoe for a customer, it was ready-made shoes, kind of the beginnings of mass production. And you started to see that show up. They that was cheaper, and so the journeymen weren't getting paid as much for them.
Okay. I can hear Nike's ears perking up right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Just do it. Make a sweatshop.
So by the 1790s, market work had started to become more common, and it started to threaten the wages of journeymen. So you could tell people were starting to get a little upset about it. And there were a couple strikes, where the journeymen, basically just came together and said, all right, we're not doing this anymore, raise our wages. And they were, it was 50-50 on whether or not they were successful. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. You also started to see scab labor show up, and it was called scab labor at the time, which is kind of cool.
Really? That term goes back a little while.
Yeah. And so these were basically workers who didn't go through the official apprentice system and picked up the work on the side or on the cheap. And they were undercutting wages and making life harder for everybody. With all of this going on and people getting pissed off, the shoemaker or the journeyman shoemakers created the Federal Society of Journeyman Cordwainers of Philadelphia.
I can't wait till the 20th century when they invented acronyms.
So at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 19th century, that work started to shift, and you started to see more market work show up, specifically for export to the southern markets and the Caribbean. And what that was basically making poor quality, cheap shoes for enslaved people.
Okay.
Yeah. So I want to point out just a real quick side note, because this still seems to be a point of contention for some reason among people that want to have a very skewed view of history. Even in northern states that didn't have slavery, their economies were still really closely tied to the system of enslavement. And this is a really good example of it, where even in Pennsylvania, which had abolished slavery, there was a lot of money to be made in the southern slave market by selling them goods. And it wasn't just shoes. They were also selling flour and butter down to the Caribbean, because most of the sugar islands were so monocultured. So they literally only grew sugar on them.
Yeah.
There wasn't enough arable land left to feed the population there, so they had to import most of their food. And a lot of that came from Pennsylvania. That's the context in which all of this is happening. The grievance that the journeyman cordwainers had was between 1800 and 1805. The masters had initially offered working on export shoes as a neat little side gig. So you needed some extra pocket money. Oh, here's 2 little projects you could work on. Yeah, okay, that's fun. And then as time progressed, the masters were realizing that they had a higher profit margin on the export shoes.
Yeah.
So they started reducing the amount of work they were giving that was like traditional shoemaking, so specific or a bespoke shoe for a customer. They would reduce that and just offer more and more export shoes to make. By 1805, or by the fall of 1805, the journeymen basically said enough is enough, and they wanted at least an end or a reduction to the export work or a raise in wages.
Sorry, baby.
So they went on strike in the fall of 1805, and it lasted for 7 weeks. The strike ended because all of the masters sued 8 of the journeymen, or they got 8 of the journeymen to be indicted and tried for criminal conspiracy to raise wages. And this case was one of the first examples of basically the masters or the bosses using the law to break up workers. The arguments used were pretty ridiculous. Basically, the masters were saying, you can't fight for better wages because other members of the trade who aren't in your union might want to work for lower wages. So you're forcing them to not work so that they can get better wages.
What the hell?
Yeah. So that's some nonsense, but that was their argument. Or like a very reductive explanation of their argument. That's basically what it boiled down to. They were arguing that doing so violated English common law, had a bunch of stuff in there for basically preventing conspiracy to raise prices, because under the guild system, like if it was just the guild system, the masters could just jack up prices and then no one could afford shoes. So the defense, which was the workers or the journeymen, argued that English common law no longer applied because, like 20 years ago, they had this whole revolution to no longer be part of England. They were actually arguing that the masters represented an unjust tyranny over the workers, not unlike the king's tyranny over the former colonies. So there were also some like underlying politics in all of this. So the bosses were mostly aligned with the Federalist Party, which was basically trying, this is, again, a very reductive explanation, but they were basically trying to bring about capitalism. Democrats, or the Democratic Republicans, that was more of like Jefferson's party, and they were, I would hesitate to say that they were anti-capitalist, but they were more that weird sort of like independent farmer anarchist thing, and they were all about like liberty and freedom for landed white men. They didn't really mention the whole thing about having slaves. So the judge was a Federalist and politically aligned with the prosecution, and his ruling on it was basically, nope, markets are cool. And
Nice.
You can't mess with markets.
Can't mess with markets.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
So the journeyman lost, and this set precedent to basically make unions illegal in the U.S. for the first like 30 or 40 years of the 1800s.
Lovely.
And set U.S. labor progress back a lot.
And it has even started.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, like it was
less-
like just picking up and then nope.
Yeah.
But one cool thing that did happen is they established, so the journeymen, after the ruling, and basically when they were being forced to go back to work for all the bosses, they actually established a cooperative warehouse so that they would pool all of their money and buy all of the materials they needed to keep producing shoes.
Okay.
Because the other side of the trend that you keep seeing is, or that I keep seeing in U.S. labor history, is like you have workers constantly being shut down and destroyed. But then you always have like this little mini socialist experiment that pops up, and people are like, hey, this is kind of a cool way of doing things. Oh God, the bosses crushed us. And like, but it keeps popping up. And basically my point is that this whole like, hey, we should work together to build an economy that works for all of us idea isn't new, and like kind of predates the American Revolution.